The date is August 8, 1945. Within the heavy stone walls of the Imperial Japanese Navy Ministry in Tokyo, the atmosphere has curdled into a thick mixture of stagnant heat and industrial dread. Blackout curtains remain drawn tight against the summer sun, trapping the scent of stale cigarette smoke and the metallic tang of cooling fans that spin without relief. Outside the district of Kasumigaseki carries the hollow silence of a city that has been scoured by fire and exhaustion. But inside this room, the silence is of a different quality. It is the silence of men waiting for a pulse that has stopped. In the communication center, the rhythmic clicking of teleprinters provides the only heartbeat. Sailors in sweat-soaked uniforms lean over their receivers with a desperate intensity, as if they could conjure voices out of the static through sheer will. Every few minutes, a bell rings and a strip of paper feeds through the machine with a dry, rasping sound. A petty officer watches the characters appear line by line. He reads the tape once, then again, his lips moving in a silent prayer of disbelief. The words are written in the precise formal language of the Navy, yet the reality they describe is impossible to grasp. The messages are not about a defeat or a retreat. They are about a void. Hiroshima has ceased to exist as a point of contact. The petty officer looks for the usual signals from the port or the garrison but finds nothing. There are no reports of survivors arriving at the designated collection points along the rail lines. There is no confirmation of the airfield status. The last report from the local air station simply ends in the middle of a sentence, as if the hand holding the key had been jerked away by a ghost. Even the short-clipped shorthand of military reporting begins to unravel into something that feels more like superstition than strategy. The petty officer stands up so abruptly that his chair scrapes harshly against the floor. He carries the narrow strip of paper with both hands, holding it away from his body as if the ink itself might be radioactive. He passes it to a chief signals officer whose eyes narrow into slits of concentration. The chief moves quickly through the crowded desks, weaving past younger aides who sense the shift in the room. He reaches the corridor, where a senior officer of signals waits with a leather folder tucked under his arm. Upstairs, behind heavy double doors, the air is even more stifling. Here, the High Command of the Imperial Navy sits in a room dominated by maps that suddenly look like artifacts from an ancient century. Charts of the inland sea and the approaches to Kyushu are pinned to the walls covered in red markers that represent shipping lanes and airfields. Many of these locations no longer exist except as names on paper. Admiral Toyota Suemu, the chief of the Naval General Staff, sits at the head of the table. His uniform is perfectly pressed, but the skin of his face is hollowed out by months of sleeplessness. He does not look up when the message arrives. He simply waits. The room smells of old paper and the bitter dregs of cold tea. A lieutenant enters with a sharp click of his heels and offers the latest folder. Toyota takes the message and reads it in total silence. He does not show fear or anger, but a profound caution, as if he is stepping onto a frozen lake that he knows will not hold his weight. He passes the report to Admiral Yonai Mitsumasa, who sits nearby. Yonai reads with his head bowed under the weight of the information. He has seen the results of firebombing and the destruction of the capital, but this report is different. It does not describe the familiar geometry of ruins or the predictable patterns of fire. It describes a total absence of life and a silence so deep that it threatens to swallow the entire ministry. The heavy silence in the room is broken only by the low hum of the ceiling fans and the distant muffled sounds of the city. Admiral Yonai sets the paper down on the polished table with a deliberate slowness, as if the mere act of releasing it could cause the world to tilt. He looks toward Vice Admiral Fukudome Shigeru, who is known for his clinical approach to naval planning. Fukudome leans in to study the tape, his eyes scanning the brief descriptions of the pilot who returned from the reconnaissance flight. The officer of signals stands at attention and recounts the aviator's testimony. He describes a city that was not merely bombed, but flattened. He speaks of a strange haze that hung over the ground and a brightness that felt like the sun had descended to touch the earth. The planners and staff men around the table find themselves struggling to find a place for this information within their established doctrine. For years, they have measured the war in terms of tonnage lost and sorties flown. They understand the mechanics of a 100-bomber raid and the way incendiary clusters create firestorms in wooden districts. But the report from Hiroshima describes something that does not fit into the ledger of conventional warfare. It describes a wide raw scar on the earth where a city used to be. There are no reports of the usual curtains of flame that follow a massive strike. Instead, there is only a vast stillness and a smoke that behaves unlike anything they have ever seen. One junior officer, emboldened by the tension, suggests that perhaps this is an exaggeration or the result of a massive accidental explosion at a munitions depot. He mentions the firebombing of Nagoya and the raids on the naval yards at Kure as points of comparison. He argues that the Americans are masters of psychological warfare and that this may be a coordinated effort to spread panic. The room turns toward him, but there is no hostility in the gazes of the senior admirals. Instead, there is a quiet pity. They have read the signals and they know that a magazine explosion does not silence an entire regional headquarters. They know that no conventional formation of B-29 bombers could have approached the city without being detected by the early warning net. Admiral Toyota uses a pencil to trace the coastline of the inland sea on the map. He touches the point to the location of Hiroshima with the precision of a surgeon. He points out that the reports from ship captains in the area are consistent with the aerial view. These captains report that the landmarks they have used for years to navigate the coast are simply gone. The silhouettes of buildings and hillsides have been altered. One report claims the shoreline looks as though it has been scraped clean by a giant hand. Toyota speaks in a voice that is devoid of emotion. He asks his staff to consider the timing of the event. It happened in a single moment with a single flash from a single weapon. The debate shifts from the fact of the destruction to the nature of the weapon itself. If it is true that one aircraft can erase a city, then the entire framework of national defense has collapsed. A vice admiral with a long record of surface combat asks what this means for the fleet. He wonders aloud how a battleship or a cruiser could possibly defend a coastline against an enemy that does not need to engage in a duel. In the old world of naval combat, a bombardment was a predictable exchange of fire. Now it seems the enemy has found a way to deliver death from the sky without warning, or the need for a massive formation. The officers stare at the map, and for the first time, the red pins representing their remaining forces look like children's toys. Admiral Toyota looks at the pencil in his hand, and then at the map as if the wood and graphite have become heavier than a sword. The realization begins to circulate through the room like a cold draft. For decades, these men have been trained in the doctrine of the decisive battle. They believed that if they could lure the American fleet into one final cataclysmic encounter, they could inflict enough damage to force a negotiated peace. Their entire worldview was built on the geometry of range and the thickness of steel plate. Now as they stare at the void where Hiroshima once stood, that entire logic feels like a relic from a forgotten age. The chief of the Naval General Staff speaks to the room in a low tone that carries the weight of a final judgment. He notes that their remaining resources are being held in reserve for the defense of the home islands. They have hidden their destroyers in coves and camouflaged their remaining aircraft under netting in the forests. They have planned for a war of attrition, where every inch of beach would be bought with blood. But the silence from the inland seas suggests that the enemy is no longer interested in the beaches. If a single aircraft can deliver the destructive power of 1,000 bombers, then the traditional concept of a defensive perimeter has vanished. Vice Admiral Fukudome leans forward, his hands pressing against the edge of the table. He is a man who thinks in terms of logistics and sorties, and he realizes the arithmetic of this new reality is impossible to solve. He points out that their current air defense system is designed to intercept mass formations. They rely on detecting large groups of planes and scrambling fighters to break up the attack. However, they cannot maintain a permanent patrol over every city in the empire to stop a single lone intruder flying at high altitude. If they cannot guarantee the interception of every single plane, then they cannot guarantee the survival of any single city. The room turns its gaze to the charts of the coastlines. In the corner of the room, a junior staff officer begins to speak about the pride of the Navy, the great base at Kure. He mentions the anti-aircraft batteries and the remaining hulls of the fleet that sit in the harbor. But his voice trails off before he can finish the thought. Everyone in the room understands the unspoken conclusion. If a flash can erase a city, it can erase a harbor. The armor of a battleship or the concrete of a bunker offers no protection against a weapon that turns the very air into a furnace. The defensive lines they have drawn with such care are now nothing more than ink on paper. Admiral Yonai watches the younger officers and sees the confusion in their eyes. Their education and their experience have prepared them for a war of ships and guns, but they are now facing a war of physics and total annihilation. He reflects on the fact that the traditional measures of naval power, such as displacement and caliber, have been rendered irrelevant in a single morning. The idea of a heroic sacrifice or a final charge against the enemy fleet feels like a fantasy when the enemy can destroy the heart of the nation without ever coming within range of a coastal gun. The realization settles into the marrow of the High Command. They are not merely losing a war, they are witnessing the end of a military era. The doctrine of the Imperial Navy was based on the idea that courage and skill could overcome material disadvantages. But as they look at the reports of the scoured earth and the missing landmarks, they see a power that does not care about courage. It is a power that operates on a scale beyond human bravery. The map of Japan is no longer a battlefield to be contested, but a list of targets waiting for a flash that they have no power to stop. The heavy atmosphere of the room is shattered when the door swings open once again, and an aide enters with a face as pale as bone. He carries a new set of transcripts that have just been pulled from the naval radio monitors. The room goes still as he delivers the news that a second strike has occurred. The location is Nagasaki. For a moment, the admirals are frozen by the sheer impossibility of the report. If Hiroshima was a nightmare, then Nagasaki is the confirmation that the nightmare has become a repeatable reality. The shock of the first event had allowed for a small sliver of denial, but the second strike removes the last refuge of doubt. This is not an accident or a singular miracle of destruction. It is a systematic process of deletion. As the officers pass the new reports around the table, a staff officer brings in translations of intercepted enemy broadcasts. It is here that the word atomic is first spoken aloud in the ministry. The Americans are claiming to have harnessed the fundamental energy of the universe. The word sounds technical and distant, like something from a university lecture hall, yet it lands among the gold braid and medals like a physical blow. Atomic power suggests a scale of energy that makes their stores of oil and their tons of high explosives look like toys from a previous century. They begin to understand that they are not just facing a new bomb, but a new era of human capability. Vice Admiral Fukudome leans over the table, his voice reduced to a dry whisper as he repeats the word. He asks the technical advisors what this means for the future of the conflict. If the Americans have found a way to compress the power of 1,000 raids into a single casing, then the concept of attrition is dead. In a conventional war, a nation might survive by losing a few percent of its strength in each encounter. But in an atomic war, the loss is 100% at every point of contact. There is no middle ground between existence and non-existence. The admirals look at one another and see their own terror reflected in the eyes of their peers. The report from Nagasaki begins to fill in the gruesome details. Like Hiroshima, the city has been silenced. The naval district offices there are not responding, and the local rail lines have reported a total collapse of authority. The Americans are broadcasting that this is only the beginning, and that they possess a supply of these weapons that can be delivered at will. The admirals are forced to confront a terrifying question regarding the industrial capacity of their enemy. They know how quickly the Americans built their carrier fleets and their thousands of aircraft. If they can produce atomic weapons with the same speed, then the Japanese islands are merely waiting for their turn to be erased from the map. Admiral Yonai stands and walks to the window, his back to the room. He thinks of the sheer scale of the tragedy and the technical mastery required to achieve it. The word atomic signifies a gap in knowledge and power that Japan cannot bridge in the time it has left. He realizes that the Americans have moved beyond the traditional battlefield and into a realm where they can dictate the terms of survival itself. The second city name sits in the room like an unexploded shell. It proves that Hiroshima was not a desperate gamble, but a demonstrated method. The war room feels smaller now, as if the walls themselves are cowering from the sky. The silence following the news of Nagasaki is broken by the arrival of a naval medical officer. He wears a white coat that is gray with dust and sweat, and his hands tremble slightly as he lays out a series of handwritten notes. These are not strategic assessments of buildings or bridges, but observations of the human body. He speaks of a type of injury that defies the experience of any surgeon in the room. He describes burns that appear on the skin without any direct contact with flame, and shadows of people scorched onto walls, while the bodies themselves have vanished. The admirals listen as he explains that the weapon does not only kill through blast and heat, but through a lingering invisible poison. He recounts stories from survivors who fled the ruins of Hiroshima, only to fall ill days later in the safety of the countryside. Their hair falls out in clumps and their gums bleed without cause. Even those who appeared completely uninjured on the first day are now dying of a fever that no medicine can touch. The doctor explains that the very ground in the center of the strike has become a place of death where even the water and the air carry the sting of the weapon. This is the moment when the military mind is forced to confront a horror that exceeds the boundaries of combat. It is no longer a matter of losing soldiers, but of the slow and agonizing decay of the entire population. Admiral Toyota asks a question that is chilling in its pragmatism. He wants to know if the affected areas can be reoccupied or if the rail lines can be repaired by labor battalions. The doctor shakes his head with a look of profound sorrow. He cannot guarantee that any man who enters the zone will survive the week. The realization settles over the table that the atomic bomb is not just a tool of destruction, but a barrier that denies the land to the living. A city hit by this weapon is not a ruin to be rebuilt, but a dead zone to be avoided. The geography of the empire is being transformed into a series of poisoned voids. Admiral Yonai watches the faces of his colleagues and sees the final collapse of the warrior spirit. For years, they have spoken of the glorious sacrifice of the 100 million and the idea that the Japanese spirit could overcome any material hardship. But spirit cannot fight a sickness that rots the blood. Spirit cannot hold a defense line when the very air becomes a carrier of death. Yonai realizes that his duty has shifted from winning a war to ensuring the biological survival of the Japanese people. If the Americans continue to drop these weapons, there will be no nation left to defend and no people left to carry on the imperial line. The discussion moves toward the absolute necessity of preserving the state. The admirals begin to speak of the emperor not just as a political figurehead, but as the singular anchor of the national identity. If the capital is struck and the administrative heart of the country is vaporized, the social fabric of Japan will dissolve into chaos. They see that the Americans have found a way to decapitate the nation without landing a single soldier on the beaches. The choice is no longer between victory and defeat, but between a managed surrender and total extinction. The maps on the wall are now useless because they describe a world where boundaries and terrain still matter. In the era of the atomic flash, the only thing that matters is the preservation of the spark of life. As the sun begins to set over the jagged skyline of Tokyo, the heat inside the Navy Ministry becomes almost physical. However, the greatest danger is no longer the American bombers circling in the clouds, but the growing friction within the Japanese military itself. In the dimly lit corridors of the ministry, the air is charged with a new kind of electricity. The sound of heavy boots echoing against the wooden floors is constant, and the groups of junior officers huddled in the shadows no longer disperse when a superior walks by. They speak in hushed tones of betrayal and the preservation of national honor at any cost. Admiral Yonai sits in his office and listens to the reports of unrest. He knows that the decision to accept the reality of the atomic bomb has made him a target for those who believe that surrender is a fate worse than death. A captain enters the room without the usual formalities and whispers that several army units are moving toward the center of the city. There are rumors that younger officers in both the army and the navy are plotting to seize the imperial palace to prevent the emperor from speaking the word of peace. This is the ultimate internal nightmare of a nation at the edge of the abyss. The unity that once defined the empire is fracturing into 1,000 pieces of jagged glass. Admiral Toyota joins Yonai, and the two men discuss the security of their communications. They realize that if the hardline factions gain control of the radio stations or the telegraph lines, they can suppress the truth of the atomic destruction and force the nation into a suicidal final battle. Toyota orders his most loyal guards to secure the naval transmission centers. He understands the irony of the situation where the Navy must now prepare for a battle against its own countrymen to ensure that the war against the foreign enemy can finally end. The corridors of power have become a labyrinth of suspicion, where no one knows for certain who is a patriot and who is a conspirator. The tension reaches a breaking point when news arrives of a specific plot to intercept the imperial messengers. Yonai realizes that the fanatics are not merely acting out of anger, but out of a desperate belief that they are the true guardians of the Japanese spirit. They view the admirals and the ministers who speak of the atomic threat as cowards who have been blinded by American technology. In the minds of the plotters, the spiritual power of the Japanese people can still overcome the material power of the atom. Yonai knows this is a delusion that will lead to the total erasure of the country. He orders the ministry to be placed on full alert and for the naval police to monitor every entrance. The night is filled with the sound of motorcycles and the sharp clicking of pistol slides being checked in the dark. In the ministry basements, clerks work by candlelight to shred sensitive documents and prepare for a possible siege. The conflict is no longer about territory or ships, but about the voice of the nation. If the emperor's decision can be kept secret, then the war will continue until there is nothing left to burn. Yonai and Toyota stand together in the flickering light of the war room, knowing that the next few hours will determine whether Japan survives as a people or disappears as a legend of fire. In the deep stillness of the early morning hours on August 15, the Imperial Palace becomes the center of a desperate struggle that will decide the fate of millions. Inside a small stone building within the palace grounds, the Emperor of Japan stands before a microphone to record the words that will end the war. His voice, which has never been heard by the common people of his nation, is being captured on a set of phonograph discs. These discs are the most precious and dangerous objects in the empire. They contain the command to endure the unendurable, and to lay down arms in the face of a weapon that threatens to destroy the human race. Outside the recording room, the darkness is filled with the sound of chaos. A group of rebel army officers convinced that the emperor has been misled by his advisors has breached the palace gates. They move through the ornate hallways with flashlights and drawn swords searching for the recordings. They believe that if they can destroy these discs, they can stop the surrender and force the nation back into the fire. In the Navy Ministry, Admiral Yonai receives word of the palace uprising. He realizes that the fragile bridge to peace is being targeted by the very men sworn to protect the throne. He orders the naval guards to stand ready, but he knows that any open combat within the palace would be a final stain on the honor of the service. The rebel officers seize the palace guard and begin a room-by-room search for the Imperial Chamberlain. They demand the location of the recordings, but the palace staff remains silent even under the threat of death. In a masterstroke of deception, the discs are hidden in a small bundle of laundry and placed in a modest storage room used by the palace ladies-in-waiting. The fanatics sweep past the room several times, never imagining that the voice of a god could be hidden among common linens. This narrow escape is the only thing standing between the survival of Japan and a final descent into a purposeless national suicide. Across the city, the tension reaches a fever pitch at the headquarters of the National Broadcasting Corporation. Armed soldiers have surrounded the building, and some have even entered the studios to demand that no broadcast be made. However, the naval intelligence officers who remained loyal to Yonai and the peace faction have already secured the transmission lines. They work in the shadows of the radio towers, ensuring that the signal can reach from the heart of Tokyo to the farthest reaches of the empire. They know that once the emperor speaks, the rebellion will lose its legitimacy and the military will be forced to obey the supreme authority. Inside the Navy Ministry, Admiral Toyota watches the clock. He has spent his life calculating the odds of victory, but now he is calculating the minutes until the voice of the emperor can reach the people. He knows that every hour of delay is an hour where the Americans might prepare a third atomic flash. The reports from Hiroshima and Nagasaki are never far from his mind, and he views the rebel officers not as patriots, but as men who are inviting the total erasure of their ancestors and their children. The air in the war room is stagnant and heavy as the admirals wait for the noon broadcast. As the sun rises, the rebel movement begins to lose its momentum. Without the discs, and without the support of the highest-ranking commanders, the uprising starts to crumble. The leaders of the coup, realizing their failure, commit ritual suicide in the palace gardens, their blood soaking the earth they tried to save through destruction. The discs are retrieved from their hiding place and transported under heavy guard to the radio station. The struggle for the voice of Japan is over, and the path is finally clear for the most significant broadcast in history. At exactly noon on August 15, the national anthem plays over every radio in the empire. It is followed by a voice that is thin and high-pitched, echoing through the empty corridors of the Navy Ministry and out into the silent streets of Tokyo. Admiral Yonai and Admiral Toyota stand at attention, their eyes fixed on the small speaker on the wall. For the first time, the people of Japan hear the emperor speak directly to them. He speaks of the war situation that has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage and of a new and most cruel bomb that has the power to destroy the innocent. He commands the nation to endure the unendurable and to build a new future. As the broadcast ends, a profound silence settles over the war room. There are no cheers of relief and no cries of anger. Instead, there is a heavy sense of finality, as if a great wall has collapsed. Outside the ministry windows, the city seems to have stopped moving. People stand frozen where they were when the voice began, some weeping, and others staring into the distance with vacant eyes. The surrender is not just a military event, but a spiritual and physical transformation of the nation. The empire that these admirals spent their lives building and defending has ceased to exist in the span of a few minutes. Admiral Yonai sits down and exhales a long, slow breath. He looks at his hands and realizes they are no longer the hands of a war minister, but of a man who must now navigate a landscape of ruins. He reflects on the reports from Hiroshima and Nagasaki and realizes that the atomic flash has achieved what no fleet could ever do. It has forced the military to confront the limits of human will. For centuries, the warrior code held that courage was the ultimate weapon, but the atom has proven that technology can now bypass courage entirely. A world has been born where a single pilot can decide the fate of 1,000,000 souls without ever seeing their faces. Toyota moves to the map table and begins to roll up the charts of the inland sea and the defense sectors of Kyushu. He handles the paper with a strange tenderness, as if he is burying a friend. He knows that these maps are now historical curiosities. The tactical problems they once represented, such as fuel consumption and anti-aircraft coverage, are obsolete. In the shadow of the atomic bomb, the very nature of sovereignty and defense has changed. No nation can truly be secure when the sky itself can become a source of instantaneous annihilation. He realizes that the navy he loved is not just defeated, but has been made irrelevant by the arrival of a new age. In the hallways of the ministry, the junior officers who were recently filled with fire and fury are now wandering like ghosts. The logic of the atomic bomb has smothered the heat of their rebellion. They finally understand what the admirals realized days ago, that there is no honor in the total extinction of one's people. The silence from Hiroshima, which once felt like a mystery, has now become a lesson for the entire nation. The void left by the two vanished cities has become the foundation upon which a new and uncertain peace must be built. The day begins to fade and the sticky summer heat of Tokyo remains, but the tension that has gripped the ministry for years is gone. Yonai and Toyota share a final look of mutual recognition. They are survivors of a world that ended at Hiroshima. They understand that the history of humanity will now be divided into two eras, the time before the flash and the time after. As they prepare to leave the ministry for the last time, they carry with them the heavy knowledge that while the war is over, the challenge of living in an atomic world has only just begun.